welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining the third of 4 talks in our series, Charting the Path Forward, Engaging Science, Policy, and Practice to Reduce Gun Violence Disparities. And so grateful and excited to have Emily here, Emily Torres, who's the project manager for the National Center for School Safety. Emily has worked with NCSS, as the acronym, since 2019. And she has experience with youth violence prevention, community engagement, and providing technical assistance to schools to improve health and safety. Today, Emily's going to share more about the comprehensive NCSS school safety model, and she's going to highlight a variety of strategies to improve school safety, their evidence base, and considerations for advancing equity within school safety. So, Emily, thank you so much for being here, and you can take it away.
Thanks, Lainey. Hello, everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces, and welcome to those that I don't know. Like Lainey said, I'm Emily with the National Center for School Safety. So I'm going to pull my slides up here. All right. I have to say I'm used to presenting this to community members and practitioners. So if I fall into some of my practitioner language, there's plenty of data in here, but I always start off when I do these talks with just a reminder, and it's a good reminder for all of us too, that if you need help, this is a very difficult topic. It's hard to talk about school safety. And there's a lot of resources available. If you're at University of Michigan, I know that there's faculty and staff resources, student resources available. The Trevor Project in particular is a little bit more student facing here for when I usually give this, but please take care of yourself in this presentation. And if you all need any support, I'll have this slide at the end as well, because I know we have to take care of ourselves in order to do this work as well. So. That's my caveat to start, and then I'm going to present a little bit of data about school safety in the US, and then I'm going to talk about the comprehensive model and share some more specifics about school safety strategies. So diving right into data a little bit here. There were 303 school shootings in 2022 across the US. A typical student is in school about 180 days a year, to put this into perspective. This story is something that we're hearing about in the news a lot. We've seen increases in school shootings. I'm sure you're all aware of it. But when we talk about school safety, there's also a lot more that goes along with it. In 2021, almost 7% of students in the US reported that they were threatened or injured with a weapon on school property in the last 12 months. This data is coming from the Youth Risk and Behavior Survey, which is administered to high schoolers all across the country. This is 2021 data, so we're probably actually seeing a little bit of an underreport of this number because a lot of schools were still closed for COVID. They might not have been in full time. And we're still seeing 7% of students in the US reporting that they were threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. 9% of high school students are reporting that they are not attending, or that they didn't attend school for at least 1 or more days because of school safety concerns in the past 30 days. Black and Hispanic students were more likely than other racial groups to say that they skipped school, and students who had any same-sex partners were the most likely group to report that they skipped school because of safety concerns, with 18%, double that amount, saying that they didn't attend school because of safety concerns in the past 30 days. 15% of these high school students reported being bullied on school property in 2021. Again, reminder that this is on school property and that's our COVID number, so it's likely a little bit higher than that. This number is down from 2019, but there's disparities here as well. Nearly a quarter of students who identify as LGBTQ+ will say that they were bullied at school. So that's quite a bit higher. This number is a little bit different. 61% of high school students said that they felt close to someone at school. So the flip side of that is we have 40% of students who could not say that they felt close to somebody at school. It's a pretty high number of students. And of those that said that they did feel close to somebody at school, there were higher percentage of male students than female students, and higher percentage of white students than other racial groups that said that they felt close to somebody at school. And this is the one that I find, there's a lot of shocking data. This is the one that I find the most shocking. 22% of high school students said that they seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months. And when we look at this data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, this is self-report information coming from our high school students. We are seeing that 10% of female students said that they actually attempted suicide, and 20% of LGBTQ plus students said that they actually attempted suicide in the past 12 months. There's also some racial disparities here amongst our students, with Black students being more likely to say that they attempted suicide than Asian, Hispanic, and white students. So I present this data to try to show that mass shootings are just one part of the school safety story. And it's a very tragic, very unfortunate part of the school safety story, but mental health is also worsening for our students. We're seeing these numbers trending down. There are still disparities in quite a lot of this data. And while it's definitely something that needs attention, there is some good news I don't want to lose, that we do know that there are some things that are working. And if we look at the last 2 decades of data, a lot of these things, though still too high, have been steadily and dramatically dropping. On a day-to-day basis, when we're looking at violence in schools that is not related to school shootings, it's actually, the picture is that our kids are a little bit safer than they were 2 decades ago. So it's definitely, something where these numbers are way too high, but we do know what's starting to work. And the what works in the school safety world is relatively new. I'm seeing some of my NCSS teammates on here, and they've heard me talk about how this evidence base is really developing. We're just learning in the last maybe 10 years about what's working in school safety. And what we know is that schools really need to take a comprehensive approach to school safety. And you've probably heard maybe like whole school, whole child is how CDC defines that. There's other organizations that talk about that in different ways. This comprehensive safety kind of language is coming from the National Institutes of Justice. We see the Department of Justice really involved in the school safety work. But when we start talking about comprehensive safety, there's no one definition of what that looks like and what that means. And there's no, one clear thing that's going to work in every single environment. So at NCSS, we really work to try to define what does comprehensive school safety look like and what are some pathways towards it. I'm going to start with a conceptual model. We call this our positive youth development approach to school safety. And I'm starting my conceptual model here on the right-hand side. I know it's a little unconventional for those that are used to conceptual models, but I like to situate that schools are really a unique context. And when we're talking about schools, we're talking about their goal is to educate students, right? They're trying to have students who come out of the school system and can go on to do the next thing, be contributing members of society. Whatever it is you want to define that, whatever that metric is, we call it positive youth development. That's really the goal in the school system. And there's so much data that safety has to be part of that. It's a precursor to students reaching that positive youth development piece. And it's not just, are you physically safe in school, but it's also, do you feel safe in school? Do you feel emotionally safe in school, mentally safe in school? All those things that we're sort of bucketing here as psychological safety, leading into as a precursor to this positive youth development piece. And part of the reason I situate here is I think when we're talking to schools, there's so many competing priorities. There's so many things they have to do. There's so much testing. There's so many pieces. And this idea that safety has to be part of the conversation, they know, but it's really hard. So I'm going to tell you about this comprehensive model with this caveat that this is really easy to talk about and really hard to put into practice. All right, I'm going to start now more traditionally with my left end of the conceptual model, and fill in to show how we think about reaching psychological and safety and positive youth development. So we start on the left-hand side with our school safety strategies. So our goal is to help schools and districts and school safety collaborators come up with school safety strategies that can have a comprehensive influence. And when they're picking those school safety strategies, like I mentioned earlier, there is no one size fits all. They have to consider what's going on in their community. What are students walking into their doors with? What are caregivers like in their community? What are their needs? What does that look like? What are the local policies? What are the state policies? Even like, what are the school board policies that are influencing what strategies they're going to be able to choose? And of course, we have to consider capacity. Staff are such a big part of schools and school safety, and our ultimate goal is positive youth development. We sometimes forget that we have to keep our staff safe in schools too, and their capacity is such a big part of all of this. So considering those things, we pick a selection of strategies. And when we're talking about our way of thinking about comprehensive safety, we're hoping to choose strategies that fit into 3 buckets here: the social environment, the attentive environment, and the physical environment. And what this means is social is kind of, I think, one of the more easy ones to understand. It's interpersonal. It's what does the climate, what does the culture feel like? Do you feel like you have trusted adults at school? Do you feel welcome? Do you feel like you belong? What are those interpersonal relationships between teachers and students, teachers and teachers, students and students? What do those things look like? That's sort of, there's a whole bunch of strategies that influence that sort of social environment. Then there's strategies that influence this attentive environment. And so the attentive environment's a little bit, I think, the harder one to understand here. This is the idea that we need to pay attention. We need to have a sort of culture of listening into what's going on, and having, ears to the ground, so to speak. What's going on in our environment that are we hearing from students? Do we know what the issues are? Do we know do they hear things that they don't feel like they can share with folks? What does that sort of listening environment, that attentive environment, feel and look like? And then we hope that there's strategies in this physical environment that are influencing that component. And so that's what I think folks think of sometimes as more traditional school safety. It's what does the actual school building look like? Are there, what is the lighting? What is the fencing? What are the entrances? Is there equipment that's being used? And so when we talk about comprehensive safety, we're trying to choose strategies that influence the social, the attentive, and the physical, with the hope to lead to outcomes related to supportive climate, early detection, and deterrence. So supportive climate, again, being that, do you feel welcome? Do you feel belonging? Early detection being, are we catching things early? Whether it's a mental health concern or a school threat, are we able to identify those things early? And then deterrence being, are we stopping things before they happen, which is what a lot of those physical environment pieces are intended to do. And so within this whole picture, I have not mentioned equity at all. And we see that in a number of ways showing up here, but one of the ways that we really specifically call that out is in this equitable response bucket you see here as a moderator for these relationships. The way that we see equitable response showing up is in sort of another bucket of strategies. We can do as much as we can to prevent, and this really is a preventive model, but we also need to prepare because we know things happen. And so those response strategies are also really important to think about early. and to really think about in terms of equity, because we've seen so many response strategies. And if you are familiar with school to prison pipeline, I'm sure some of you have probably seen arrest data from schools, or maybe expulsion data that is really, inequitable. We want to make sure that however we're responding, if something does happen in a school, that we're centering equity in that, because we know that historically that has not happened in the way that it should. But that's not to say that equity is not here throughout. We really think of it as when you're thinking about what's going on with your caregivers and your community, and you're doing that strategy selection, that you're thinking about the needs of specific subgroups there in that piece too. So pulling back to big picture a lot, I know this model is a lot to take in. And so again, this is how we think about strategies leading all the way to school safety and positive youth development. So we at the National Center for School Safety, this is kind of what we do a lot. We help schools, districts think about what their strategies are, sometimes choose new ones, think about how things can be integrated so that we can make sure that they're influencing that social, that attentive, that physical environment, to try to have these early early detection, deterrent, supportive climates to lead to that psychological safety and that positive youth development. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific strategies, but if folks have questions or want to stop, I know that this model is a lot to take in the first time you're seeing it. So I'm just going to pause for a second. Please, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute, and I can try to address things too. All right. Not seeing anything come through, but keep them coming if you're still typing, and I'll just keep us moving forward here a little bit. Talking about what are those school safety strategies, there's a whole lot of things people are doing to try to keep schools safe. And this evidence base, like I said, is growing and we're still learning a lot about what works and doesn't work in schools. So I'm going to go through what we know has a clear and consistent evidence base. And the implication here, it sounds like when I read these, you're going to say that's a lot. Are schools supposed to do all of this? The intention is that they look at what they need and they pick and choose strategies that make sense to them to really try to hit that social, attentive, and physical component. So please don't take this as the school is supposed to go and do all of these things I'm about to talk about. The first thing that we know has really clear and consistent evidence base for supporting school safety are school climate programs, social emotional learning, anti-bullying. These are things like Sandy Hook Promise has what they call start with hello. That's a simple idea that you say hello to everybody when they walk in the door, and there's programming that goes along with that. But it's really this idea of, is it welcoming? Is it belonging? Are there signs in different languages so that folks can see, this is for me, I am supposed to be here. Those are all different ways to influence school climate. Social emotional learning curriculums are actually teaching students these social skills that we are not naturally born with. We do have to learn them, these emotional regulation skills that are learned over time, and really trying to do that in the classroom in integrated ways through the K-12 lifespan. And then bullying programs, things like you might have heard of like upstander programs, or even just sometimes you look like being able to tell a teacher, and there's a lot of different kinds of anti-bullying programs, but really just being able to recognize it and do something about it, right? As well as to be inclusive. And there's a lot of trainings that are evidence-based that help students kind of understand tolerance, respect, and inclusion. So these have a really, really clear and consistent evidence base for supporting school safety. Restorative practices, this idea of sort of it's a problem solving that is non-exclusionary. I mentioned suspensions and expulsions a little bit earlier. I didn't display any of that data, but there are huge disparities amongst students who are suspended and expelled from schools. We see students of color being expelled at higher rates. We see students with disabilities being expelled and suspended at much higher rates than other students. And when students are out of school, it becomes a cycle of disengaging with the school environment, right? And of course, we know that then they're not learning, we don't know where they're going, they might be in dangerous situations. So anything we can do in school to really try to keep students there and solve problems in ways that are collaborative, that help restore relationships, and to try to build some of those skills in a preventive way so that things don't escalate. It's another goal of restorative practices and in this non-exclusionary discipline. And there's actually a huge movement in the juvenile justice world to have more restorative practices and restorative justice, and really try to disrupt that school to prison pipeline that is a huge problem. So that's another equity consideration there. Trauma-informed responses and resilience orientation. So really trying to build resiliency skills in students, having students come to school with all sorts of things going on in their backgrounds. They may have experienced adverse childhood experiences. They may have, just had a really bad day with their parents the day before. We don't know what they're bringing with them to the school building. So having trauma-informed approaches universally is something that we see can help students really regulate their emotions, really be able to be better learners, better listeners. And that's something that is definitely been shown to improve school safety. And this is also a connection to those tier 2 and tier 3 supports, is what our school folks talk about a lot, this idea that some of these students may need mental health resources, right? And how are we triaging folks who might need more support and more help to be in school? So those are definitely also been shown to improve school safety. After school programming, I think this is one of the simplest things in a lot of ways that is something that we know improves school safety, especially when the students are engaged in leadership roles or in decision making or in giving back to their community. Anything that is sort of youth empowering. This is not always after school, sometimes it's extracurriculars in high schools and other ways, but those are proven, those have been shown to increase school safety. And the last one I'll go into major details here are threat assessment and other sort of threat screening programs. This is something that you may have heard about. It's a really hot thing in school safety right now. There's a lot of evidence that shows that when a threat is reported into a school, if you have a process and a multidisciplinary team, usually when we say multidisciplinary, we're talking about a school administrator, a mental health professional, and someone with a law enforcement background, if possible. Not everybody has those things, but that's when I say multidisciplinary, what I'm usually referring to. This multidisciplinary team here gets the threat, triage to them, and they actually investigate and look into and follow up and follow a process. That's really important here, right? We want to follow a set sort of process and protocol to assess, is this threat that was made credible? And if so, and this is key, how do we get the students involved supportive services? It's supposed to be a link to those supportive services for the students so that we don't have the student missing tons of school, so that we can get them the help they need to make sure that whatever threat might have been thought of as credible doesn't happen, and they get the support that they need, right, to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. So thinking about considerations for equity, the reason I said that you may have heard of this, it's a hot button issue. There are some cases where threat assessment has gone wrong, where people have used this to do more like police investigations in the name of threat assessment. We've seen in the past people feel really concerned about being labeled a threat and what that might mean for a student if it wasn't credible, but they now have this label of a threat. And I think you all can imagine that or have maybe experienced that these labels are often assigned to Black students, Black boys in particular. And so there's some real considerations when using threat assessment processes and programs. They have been shown to work. They have been shown to avert even mass shootings in schools, but they have to be done in a way where people know what you're doing and you're really following a set process, because like many things, they can be harmful if not done with fidelity. So I can also talk specifically about tons of things that are developing in the evidence base. I'm going to list some of these here, but I'm not going to go into as many details so we can get to questions you all might have. But things that have more of a developing evidence base are things like interpersonal surveillance systems. In Michigan, you might have heard of OK to Say, tip lines where students, community members can report and say, here's what I heard, I saw something, so it's the see something, say something idea, but really just this idea, even in the mental health side, that there's students who are, reporting what they're seeing amongst themselves. Active shooter trainings and lockdown drills. This is definitely more of a response strategy, right? Not necessarily something we think of as a prevention strategy. There is some developing evidence that doing these drills can support school safety. If someone is doing an active shooter drill, though, this is another case where things can go maybe not as intended, right? These can be really, really, really scary. We have to think about what's age appropriate and what we're doing afterwards to make sure that they are as trauma informed as possible. So that is definitely a key consideration with active shooting training. School resource officers, having a police officer assigned to a school. And when we're talking about in our NCSS world, the best practice for police officers assigned to schools is not that police are there in a fully sort of surveying role, disciplinary role. It's actually really important that school resource officers are there to think about protecting students and staff from outside threats, as well as SROs as mentors and as educators. How are they engaging with students in helpful ways? How can this be, in some ways, a body in your school that their sole job is to think about safety? And how can we think about that in terms of supporting some of these resiliency aspects as well? So there's evidence developing that if school resource officers are playing more of that role of mentor, educator, as well as protector, that can be really, really helpful for school safety. Door locks, you may have heard a lot about door locks. That's something that has, I think logically we can think if a door can lock, that can help prevent somebody from getting inside. That is something that is developing in the evidence base. Signage, are your doors numbered? Are things labeled? Again, feels really, in some ways, common sense, but that's something that is sort of in this, if done well, it can be really helpful. Crime prevention through environmental design. I know many of you might be working or have worked on CEPTED projects in the past. That can be applied to schools to think about lighting and fencing and secure entrances and all that stuff. Coordination with law enforcement. This is actually meeting, with schools, law enforcement, and first responders to say, if something does happen, how are we responding together? How are we communicating, just coordinating what that's going to look like? There's some developing best practices in that space. And then extreme risk protection orders. I know there's probably been a lot of talk in this group about extreme risk protection orders in other areas. We have seen some support for those, that they actually help increase school safety as well. So a benefit of those. And then there are some things that people are doing really commonly that have more limited or mixed evidence base. These are the things that a lot of people maybe think of as more traditional school safety: video cameras, metal detectors, things that we might call target hardening, armed teachers, armed security personnel. There's a new trend in schools of using a lot of AI or other technology identified monitoring, gunshot detection, cameras that can immediately tell your law enforcement, new metal detectors that use AI to try to detect things. There's really mixed evidence on and limited evidence on whether these things actually support school safety. And I always make the caveat here that there's actually some evidence that these do not support school safety. There's new evidence that the more things that you do in sort of this target hardening, these video cameras, these metal detectors, they can actually make schools feel less safe, more prison-like, and that can be harmful for your school climate. It can also be harmful to students who might be thinking, how do I protect myself at school? Or do I skip school because I'm worried about safety? Some of those data that I was talking about earlier. So it's not to say that we won't learn more information about some of these things and learn that there are ways to do it that can be helpful. But right now we have pretty limited or mixed evidence about a lot of these things. But that was a lot of information in a half hour. I said this earlier, but if you all want more info about any of these individual strategies, we have resources for almost all of these things on our website. I just put it in the chat, so feel free to visit the training and technical assistance site. And I can definitely send a copy of these slides. We also have a short one-pager that summarizes a lot of this information too, that we can send out to folks. If you're curious at all about our center, we are a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional training and technical assistance center. We serve schools all across the country, and there's tons of free resources on our website. Everything we put out is free. We can also work one-on-one with schools or other school safety collaborators. And I know some of you in the room have worked with people that we have produced these short little abstract videos of research. So if there's something that you're doing in school safety that you would love to translate to a practitioner audience, let us know. We're always looking for that kind of thing too. And I'm just going to put this up again, that if you need supportive services, you need to take care of yourself, there's some ways to do it. You can also, like I mentioned, I know there's faculty and staff and student resources at U of M if you're here. And I'll stop in 35 minutes. It was a lot of info. So what questions do you all have, or what's still on your mind?